July 25, 1944, RAF pilot Henry Talala, like so many young pilots during World War II, fails to return to base.
There's lots of Germans up.
Henry Talala was flying one of the most feared fighter planes of its time.
It was a frightening aeroplane to fly for a newcomer.
You know, if you open up the throttle too quickly, you could go into a ground loop, you know, the aeroplane would flip on its back, and then they lost a lot of pilots like that.
This is the story of a son who left his homeland of Malaya to fight a war more than 5,000 miles away.
And all he did was to just wave his hand to us. He was just a very simple departure.
And how his family's determination to uncover answers leads them to a small village in northern France.
Some people come with a metal detector, and they've found bits of shrapnel.
Almost 7 decades later, the unheard-of Henry Talala is remembered by modern Malaysia as one of their last piloting heroes. July 1944, and the world is at war. Europe takes center stage. 50 days after the surprise D-Day landings, Hitler moves vast battalions of equipment and men to Normandy to stop the Allied forces advancing further into France. He bombards British and Canadian forces with Nazi Germany's most formidable weapon, the deadly Panzer tank divisions. Robust and heavily armored, the German tanks have dominated ground battles across the European continent.
Before the invasion, the German Panzer divisions thought that they'd got it made in terms of armor and range and penetration that were far superior to the British, the Allied tanks.
To support the Allied troops, the RAF developed a potent weapon, a rocket-firing killing machine considered at that time to be the fastest single-seat fighter plane in the world. And its name, the Hawker Typhoon.
Very fast aircraft at low level. I mean, the Typhoon would catch a 747 at 3,000 feet and shoot it down, even today.
On July 25, 1944, at 11:45 a.m., 4 British Hawker Typhoons from the 182nd Squadron prepare to take off from their French airbase. One of those pilots is 24-year-old Henry Talala. 5,000 miles away from his hometown of Kuala Lumpur, Henry has been fighting for the British for 3 years.
Henry was flying a rocket-carrying Typhoon from 182 Squadron from B6 at Toulon. So he would have been about 10, 15 kilometers from the target that he was attacking. No distance at all. So within a few moments of taking off, they would be in the target area.
Henry and his squadron are tasked with assaulting and blowing a hole in the German line of defense for Allied ground troops to exploit. Anthony Knight, an expert in British wartime aviation, describes how the target area had become a hotbed of activity.
There was a great, intense battle going on around the city of Caen because the British forces under Montgomery were still trying to take the city of Caen, and the German forces were trying to get into Normandy from the east, and there was a huge concentration of tanks and armored materiel in that area.
It was called Operation Cobra, and it was to be the start of their breakout. And so it was very important that that attack, which Henry was involved in, worked and held the Germans in front of Caen.
Fellow World War II Typhoon pilot David Entz knows that Henry and his squadron have the best tool to do the job.
But the Typhoon in particular, with its rockets, was something that the German panzers grew to fear enormously, because in terms of its hitting power, the Typhoon with 8 rockets was equivalent to the broadside from a naval cruiser.
What it could do was fly very fast, and so the Typhoons were turned over to low-level interception activities rather than high-level fighter activities.
The Typhoon's hit-and-run bombing tactics are extremely effective, destroying tanks, demolishing enemy communications, and terrifying those lucky enough to survive the onslaught.
These tank people knew that we were perhaps not as accurate, that we would hit every time, but if we hit them, it was curtains. They were finished, and they became very frightened.
But attacking the enemy at such low altitudes exposes the pilots to enormous amounts of hostile firepower. For Henry Talala and his squadron, it is a perilous position to be in.
They concentrated on the target, that there was a very big danger of becoming almost hypnotized by the target. You could see the target in front of you and you were aiming at it, and unless you were careful, you forgot about trying to pull the aircraft out. So he would have been concentrating on the operation. He wouldn't have been thinking about the anti-aircraft fire or anything else.
They planned this. They just haven't just gone in there and just decided to bomb something. So they have an entry point. They've navigated to a point where they now have fixed their position. They know where the target is from that point. So they've now turned onto the target. They've now attacked the target, and then they have an exit strategy.
Veteran Typhoon pilot and instructor Derek Lavelle knows this exit strategy only too well.
Well, you're in 1,000-pound bombs. You don't want to get below 2,000 feet, otherwise you blow yourself up. So at about 3,000 feet, remember you're going down at 450 knots or about 475 miles an hour. And when you've got the target in sight and you've got about 3,000 feet, you press your button, drop your bombs, and get the hell out of it.
Nephew and commercial airline pilot Peter Talala looks back in awe at the pilots of the Second World War.
World War II, they were still knights of the air. You know, they still dueled. They still fought one-on-one. So different. You can imagine, these guys were sitting in airfields on the grass with the smell of burning rubber, cordite, gunpowder. Bombs were falling every night on top of them, and they had to go out and do their jobs every day. Nowadays, you get in your Chevy, drive down to the office, get onto your remotely operated vehicle and kill somebody 10,000 miles away, get back in your car and play with your kids. I never met my Uncle Henry, but I did meet my Uncle Jim, and I was very young. But what I can tell you, though, is that my grandmother, which is Uncle Henry's mother, always carried a photograph of him in her Bible.
I had the impression of him as being a gentle, kind soul. He obviously had a sense of adventure, interest in the United Kingdom.
Henry Talala was born in 1920, the first of 7 children. His father, Hiwaji Talala, had left his birthplace of Ceylon in 1904 to seek his fortune and start a business in the British colony. Henry and brother Jimmy had been exposed to the idea of flying from an early age. At 13, they found themselves in the prestigious Victoria Institution in Kuala Lumpur, which their father hoped would put them on the right path to a career in aviation. Brothers Albert and Richard remember these formative years.
Henry and Cyril were pretty playful and didn't pay so much attention to their studies as they should have. Sonny was inclined to be a bit shy and reserved. Jimmy was a bit of an extrovert. He had a lot of fun. He had no problems in that regard.
Like other Malayan families of the time, Henry and Jimmy, as elder siblings, were responsible for taking care of younger brothers Richard and Albert, though not always successfully.
And you know, we were quite uncontrollable, because I remember getting the cane from my mother nearly every day. We were just out of order, you know. But we were a happy family. We got on very well. Life was good, and my parents were very caring. As they began to be of flying age, which I think was 17, either 16 or 17, I'm not sure, they immediately joined Hector, their cousin, joined the flying club and began to fly.
And of course, at that time, you know, flying an airplane was like flying the space shuttle. And whatever exams that they did do were very minimal. And the rest of it was basically you go up there with an instructor, he shows you how to do it, and if you don't kill yourself in the first few hours, you survive and you continue to fly. And that's it. You're at the cutting edge of technology.
As political tensions over Europe reach dangerous levels, the British Royal Air Force start to actively enlist young men throughout the British colonies, including Malaya.
Well, I suppose the Air Force was quite small, but they were recruiting rapidly because they could see that there was a war coming, and the Air Force was pretty small. Back in 1936-37, it was into an expansion period.
Then, the moment the world has been dreading. September 1939, Germany invades Poland and brings the whole of Europe to the brink of war. The RAF fast-tracks recruitment overseas. For the young Talala brothers, flying for the RAF was a childhood dream, and they are eager to volunteer.
Then Jimmy passed the medicals to join the Royal Air Force. Henry did not, because he was underweight.
He was a slight man who was refused admission initially, from what I understand, to the RAF, and had to bulk up in order to achieve it.
There were squadrons which were made up partly of people from overseas. There were Rhodesian squadrons, there were Ceylonese, now Sinhalese squadrons, there were Canadian squadrons, very active. So it was unusual to find an individual like Henry Talala serving with an English squadron.
Finally, Henry passes his medical, and the two brothers leave their family and friends to proudly fight for the British on the other side of the world.
Back in those days, it's a whole different ballgame. These guys were astronauts. For them, it must have been, you know, just awesome.
Jimmy had thumpingly big send-off from our home in Gulfview Road. Every single nationality represented, Chinese, Indians, Malays, everyone was there. But in contrast, my brother Henry went off in a very, very indifferent sort of way. And I remember Sonny walking down the aisle of this aircraft. I presume he was walking down, I didn't see him, but I saw him get into his seat, which was the last seat right at the back of the aircraft. And all he did was to just wave his hand to us. He was just a very simple departure. And this is the last time I ever saw my brother Henry.
"1940, the British war machine is working overtime, with the Supermarine Spitfire and Hawker Hurricane already in full-scale production. As the two Malayan brothers head to Canada for their pilot training, their contrasting personalities would see their careers veer off in different directions.
Henry was, more of a daredevil than Jimmy was. Jimmy was, calculatedly competent and did everything the right way, except that he too, I think, got into trouble early on.
Jimmy finds himself en route to flying the ever-popular and glamorous Spitfire. Elder brother Henry, however, is on a collision course with the yet-to-be-revealed new generation of fighter aircrafts, the Hawker Typhoon.
The Typhoon was actually designed as a replacement for the Hurricane and Spitfire. It was the first 400-mile-an-hour plus fighter. It was almost double the weight of a Spitfire. It was a big aeroplane, and much was expected of it.
A specification was issued by the British government in 1937 for a replacement fighter, because the Hurricane was already by then 2 years old. And there were some new engines becoming available. There was a big effort at making an engine which could produce 1 horsepower for every cubic inch of capacity of the engine.
The Typhoon, engineers believed, would change the face of the war due to its incredible speed.
To the man in the street, it's like giving a 22-year-old boy a brand new Ferrari and saying, take it for a drive.
But the problem was that it wasn't any good at high altitude. And in addition, when it was used as a bomber escort lower down, it was too fast for the bombers. And so it very nearly got cancelled.
You know, along comes a 24-cylinder Napier Sabre Typhoon with bags of horsepower. I mean, this thing was like a wild Arabian stallion, you know. It was heavier, not as maneuverable.
You then started this very noisy engine, very powerful, deep-throated engine, taxied out to the beginning of the runway, and then opened the full throttle. And they felt as if somebody hit you in the back of the neck with a sledgehammer. The sudden power.
But the rush to develop the fastest, most powerful fighter in World War II comes at a heavy cost for the British RAF. From an early age, Henry Talala had long aspired to become a distinguished aircraft pilot. His aspirations materialized when he left Kuala Lumpur in 1941.
A very large number of British pilots, and including Talala, were sent to Canada by sea. They went by ship, very dangerous across the Atlantic, after their initial training.
Henry and his fellow RAF recruits began their initial 8-week aviation training, learning to fly the friendly Tiger Moth and Fleet Finch aircraft. These twin-seater biplanes allow the trainee pilots to familiarize themselves with takeoff and landings, as well as basic flight maneuvers.
Of course, they would have been progressing through different types of aircraft, learning the skills that are required. And then they would have gone off to the United Kingdom, where they would have been posted to squadrons, and they would have been rookies, you know, and I could imagine them being very, very nervous.
After 4 months, Henry has completed almost 100 hours flying time, moving from the twin-seater trainers to the single-engine North American Harvard. With a top speed of over 330 kilometers per hour, the Harvards were specifically designed to turn the rookie airmen into fighter pilots.
I mean, that was the most happening thing that's going on in the world. Great adventure, you know, when you're that young, you don't think of death or, you know, all the bad things. You don't think of the good things, and huge adventure, faster aeroplanes, going to Europe, you know, they must have been very excited about that.
Henry Talala earns his wings as a qualified fighter pilot just as World War II hits terrifying new heights. He is quickly promoted to flight sergeant and posted to 182nd Squadron, based at Merston in the United Kingdom. In only a matter of weeks, Henry comes face to face with the Royal Air Force's highly classified new addition to their aerial arsenal, the Typhoon.
It was a frightening aeroplane to fly for a newcomer who had never flown such a thing before.
The Typhoon's reputation is already under threat. Since the start of its development in 1937, a series of tragedies involving the deaths of 26 test pilots stalls the production of this engineering masterpiece.
And the early ones had problems with visibility. The cockpit wasn't well designed. The tail fell off. They were quite a handful. They had a very bad reputation. But pilots were excited at the thought of flying this new, very powerful aircraft.
Huge amounts of horsepower, huge amounts of torque. You know, if you open up the throttle too quickly, you could go into a ground loop, you know, the airplane would flip on its back, and then they lost a lot of pilots like that. You know?
Former pilot David Entz remembers being introduced to the fighter plane by his squadron commander, Hugh Cockey.
And I was absolutely captivated by the Typhoon. And I knew it was for me, and if ever I could get into the cockpit of that airplane as a pilot, that was the one I wanted to fly in the war. And I told Cockey this, and he said, "We've got lots of problems, and you're a bloody idiot."
Also, because the engine was so extremely powerful, there were gyroscopic effects in the engine. It was very difficult to take off because you couldn't lift the tail too soon or the aircraft would swing to one side. The propeller was nearly 15 feet in diameter and very close to the ground. It was a very big, heavy, noisy. There was a lot of vibration.
But this was war, and if they grounded the Typhoons, think of the Panzers, and think of our armor, and how many tank crews would have been killed instead of those 26 pilots.
The RAF perseveres, and finally in mid-1941, the Hawker Typhoon starts rolling off the production line.
Over the years, the Typhoon was modified. The engine was increased in power. The propeller was changed. The tail was changed. The cockpit was changed to produce a wonderful bubble canopy, which gave wonderful visibility. And the aircraft was adapted to carry bombs and rockets. So it became a very powerful weapon indeed.
Flight training in Canada is now a distant memory for Henry Talala. As Germany continues targeting London with devastating nightly air raids, Henry's squadron is the country's defensive vanguard, undertaking daily sorties across the English Channel. These young pilots, barely out of their teens, now face the harsh realities of war.
When you were young, first of all, the thing was a challenge. Secondly, it was always going to happen to the other chap and not you.
Churchill described them as doing the most dangerous job that any pilot has been asked to do in the war.
So you could just imagine, there was a war going on. People were shooting at you, and you were flying the most sophisticated, fastest aircraft in the world. And in today's term, that would be like flying a F-22 Raptor.
The Hawker Typhoon proves a demanding aircraft to fly, especially in combat. And at such terrifying new speeds, RAF pilots are forced to maintain utmost discipline in the skies.
You flew in what was known as battle formation because you needed to look around and to make sure that there were no nasty Focke-Wulf 190s or Me-109s sitting up there waiting to attack you. You had to be looking around.
During the Battle of Britain, they were flying much closer together, and this is why they lost so many, because if you're flying tight formation, you're concentrating on not hitting your number one or number two. you're not looking out the back to see what's coming up behind you.
The Typhoons, also, they would fly in pairs, or they would file in single file, one after each other, you know, as they broke from the echelon formation.
So every 3 seconds you go down. So hopefully you didn't run into each other on the way down.
And then point the nose down where the target was, pick up the target, fire the ordnance, and get out of there. And use their speed as their defense.
But no matter how fast you were flying, the moment you dipped below 8,000 feet, you were exposed to the gunfire from the entire German arsenal.
There was always flak. Our problem was flak, flak, flak. The whole time I flew 136 operations, and I only saw enemy aircraft once.
Depending on your position in the attacking formation, your chances of getting hit by flak varied enormously. The most vulnerable position to be in the attacking lineup was number 3. After firing, and often missing, the first 2 planes, anti-aircraft gunners would adjust the distance, speed, and trajectory of their weapons in time for the 3rd attacking aircraft, often to deadly effect.
You could only just imagine, you know, the adrenaline. You know, you're relatively safe as you cross the channel. And then now you know that you're going to be taking out some tanks. And you know that you're coming. And they've prepared themselves. And they're going to be shooting at you. You know, the stress levels, it'll be like somebody mugging you every day on the street by gunpoint and saying, give me your money, I'm going to shoot you. And these guys were doing this every day, you know, so it must have taken a terrible toll on them.
July 1944. Continuing on from the D-Day offensive, the Allied forces maintained their march across France, pushing back the retreating Germans. Henry Talala and the 182nd Squadron based themselves in Normandy. Their role is to support the Allied ground troops by taking out German tanks, supply trains, and communication installations. Unfortunately, the realities of war are taking a toll on Henry. His initial excitement of lands far away and the chance to fly exotic aircraft has now faded. The dangerous daily sorties into enemy territory and the loss of lives from his squadron weigh heavily on the young man's shoulders.
I think at that point, reality must have sunk in. You know, people were dying. And when you went to work, you might not come back.
He must have been a very brave man to be out of his elements, foreign country, horrific conditions.
I don't think I could do it. I don't think I have the courage. Tremendous stress, strain for everybody. You know, my heart goes out to not only my uncles, but you know, the French, the Polish, the Czechoslovakians. You know, they came from everywhere. You know, terrible thing.
As Henry and his squadron fly ahead of the ground troops to engage and neutralize any enemy positions, they unwittingly fly directly into a trap. Ahead, the Germans have halted their retreat and set up a heavy anti-aircraft battery in ready position. As the 182nd Typhoon Squadron enters the target area, the sky erupts and a surface-to-air battle ensues. Henry is flying at number 3.
You know, just pure human survival instinct would kick in, and you would try anything that you could to get out of being in these gun sites. We could only imagine. But when I try to imagine it, I keep coming up with the same thing, which is sheer terror.
It's another successful mission for the 182nd Squadron, with all ordnance released and the targets destroyed. But as they hightail it out of the danger zone, one of the squadron pilots notices Henry turning in the opposite direction.
And nobody knows exactly what happened to Henry, except that he would have been one of the stream of Typhoons attacking targets. It would seem that he probably released his rockets and, because of being at very low altitude, was hit by anti-aircraft fire or might have been injured in the aircraft and unable to leave the aircraft.
And it was at a very dangerous time on that front. His squadron commander, and he was shot down but survived as a prisoner of war on the very next day.
When Henry Talala's Hawker Typhoon fails to return to base on July 25, 1944, he is officially classified as missing.
We just said, oh, he's missing, but he's probably in a German jail and we'll see him after the war.
But Brother Jimmy, now stationed temporarily in the UK, senses the urgency. He cannot wait that long and goes to extraordinary lengths to try and find his sibling.
Jimmy had got permission from his CEO, the CEO of his squadron, to go and attempt to seek out what had happened to Henry's plane and to Henry himself.
He went alone. Across the English Channel. Alone. There's lots of Germans up. They don't fly alone. They fly in formations. Focke-Wulfs, Messerschmitts. And then on top of that, there's ground fire. There's, you know, so this guy, no regard for his own life. Just gets in this airplane, disappears. Was looking for his brother. I mean, that's incredible, isn't it?
Using Henry's flight path provided by the 182nd Squadron's commanding officer, Jimmy pilots his P-51 Mustang towards Fontenay-le-Marmion in the lower Normandy region of northwestern France. Desperate to locate any sign of Henry's Typhoon, Jimmy scours the area.
The landscape was like lunar landscape, you know, there was craters everywhere, the shelling, bombing, you know, massive explosions, smoke, carnage everywhere. That's what he would have, you know, and I mean, it was basically like looking for a needle in a haystack.
October 1945, the war finally comes to an end, and after 5 years away, Jimmy Talala returns home. He holds the Distinguished Flying Cross in recognition of his acts of valor during the conflict, but returns home to Malaya with a heavy heart. His brother Henry, who he enlisted with at the start of the war, remains missing.
My mother, I mean, she did not cry or anything like that. She just said, no, he's captured. He's probably in jail, but we'll see him after the war.
And then comes the news no parent wants to hear.
The worst thing that ever happened to my mother was the confirmation letter coming from the Air Ministry. There was a communication from the War Office in London, initially to say he was missing, and then to say that he had been killed in action. And it was one of the worst events in my life, because I can my mother's sorrow is still ringing in my ears. That was in 1945 when I was 15 years old. I'm now knocking on 83, and I can still remember it. It was very, very painful. It must have been terrible for her. We were a very, very close family. We had great regard, great regard for each other.
My mother's mother was insanely in love with my Uncle Henry. And she never forgot him till the day she died. In fact, she would, if you mentioned him, tears would come out of her eyes.
Henry's father, Iwaji Talala, is stricken with grief. It was he who nurtured his son's love of flying from an early age, and he who encouraged the boys to join the RAF. With the war now at an end, he goes from the proudest father in Malaya to the most dejected, as only one of his sons returns from battle. Desperate for answers to Henry's final resting place, Hiwaji begins his own journey to the country that his sons fought to protect.
And so he did, in fact, get on a plane and go to London and go to the War Office and badger them to get as much information as he could. So he wanted to know the circumstances, he wanted to know where Sonny was, where he had been buried.
To this day, what Hiwaji Talala discovers would set a base for the strong bond between two families from opposite sides of the world. In 1941, two Malaysian brothers barely out of their teens with a love of flying joined the RAF and traveled across the world to fight as heroes against the might of the German army. 5 years later, only one returns. The eldest, Henry Talala, is classified as missing, presumed dead after a fierce air-to-ground battle during the D-Day offensive in 1944. Henry's devastated father, Hiwaji, makes a personal quest to uncover what happened to his son. Nephew Piers Talala recounts the events.
What I learned about Henry's last flying moments, I learned through efforts of my father. He tracked down individuals that were actually flying in formation with him on that final flight. One gentleman, his name is Pat Pattison, was part of the group of 4 that were flying together. And Pat came and visited my father in Canada. And what I recall from the discussions that took place was simply that they were out in formation. They'd delivered their mission, their attack, in the vicinity of Rouen, of Noyer-Bocage, and they were returning to base under heavy attack. And it was at that point that Pattison realized that there was no longer connectivity, communication with Henry Talala, that he had gone missing. And obviously, not obviously, but the impression is that he was shot down upon his return.
There were various things that could have happened, I suppose. He could have been injured and couldn't get out of his aircraft. He could have bailed out too low and his parachute didn't open in time. He could have been killed outright in the aircraft. The fact that he disappeared does suggest that either he was very gravely wounded or that he was killed.
Hiwaji Talala flies to London and visits the British Ministry of Defence. He manages to extract information that leads him to the Basse Normandy region of northwestern France. The small village of Iron has a population of less than 500 residents and is in stark contrast to his own village back in Malaya. With the help of the French police, known as the gendarmes, Hiwaji is led to a local farmer, Louis Bruy, who he hopes may offer some answers to his son's disappearance.
Well, it was the plane had come down on his field, but when it had come down, when the plane had crashed, he was not there. All civilians had been evacuated. So when civilians were allowed back, that is when he discovered this plane on his field with a grave by its side. So he assumed, of course, the pilot was buried there.
And Henry's body was found. So it was only a matter of a kilometre or so from where he was attacking targets.
I think that the Germans were probably the first on the scene to where my uncle's aircraft crashed, mainly because they might have thought he was still alive and they wanted to capture him. And then also they were very interested in some aspects of the Typhoon, upgraded gun sites and bomb sites, which they would like to take back for intelligence purposes. And perhaps, maybe not, but perhaps they even bury him.
To the people of Iran, the arrival of WWII Talala to their village provided a connection to the brave pilot buried next to his aircraft in the middle of WWII's farm. With this new information, WWII Talala and WWII make efforts to formalize the grave of young Henry.
With the assistance of a gendarme, he discovered the Bray family, met Louis Bray and his wife, and with their permission, built a small monument to commemorate the efforts and the loss of his son.
Today, visitors still visit the field and the monument, some to pay their respects, some in hope of finding more relics associated with Henry's crash.
I've been there with historians as part of a group, and some people come with a metal detector, and they've found bits of shrapnel. I think on one occasion we were in attendance, and a woman presented a relic, a piece of a plane that was believed to have been part of Henry's plane.
Almost 2 years after the discovery of the lost Typhoon, Henry is reburied, along with other unsung heroes from the Second World War, in a cemetery in Bonneville-la-Campagne. His younger brother Richard remembers visiting Henry's final resting place for the first time.
It was very poignant. You know, by that time you must remember that I was 64 years old. Very different from being a 15-year-old boy, very proud of his brother. Now, of course, everything had sunk in, and the visit was really no more this great sense of pride and the rest of it. The war had long gone.
Henry's gravestone is one of hundreds, and for Richard Talala, his brother's death at age 24 gets put into an even more tragic context.
And then suddenly my eye wandered across to the grave next to him. And it was a British Fusilier who was buried there. Age, 18. I looked at the other side, same thing. Fusilier, 18. Then I said to myself, Richard, what are you feeling so sorry about? Look at that. 2 kids, 18 years old, killed in this useless war. That was my thinking.
Although Henry's life and death seem historically distant to today's modern generation of Malaysians, the memory of Henry Talala still lives on in a tiny village in northern France.
This was all part of the efforts of Roy Crane, who is a former pilot, and a gentleman by the name of Jacques Brun. Jacques Brun was a boy at the time of the Second World War, but he developed a strong interest in the Typhoon Association and has managed to galvanize support from the French government. And so he's been responsible for the creation of the monument that is in Noyer-Bocage. He's been responsible for generating French funding. And importantly, he was responsible for generating interest in linking the 2 villages surrounding where Henry crashed. And there is a small road that links those 2 villages. And that road is now referred to officially as Route Henry Talala. In French, Route Henry Talala in English. And it's on the side of that road, deep into the field, is where my grandfather established a monument to Henry. And then About 7 years ago, the French government, under the direction and advice from Jacques Brun, established a small commemorative monument on the side of the road.
Henry Talala, a Malaysian hero fighting for the freedom of the world, lost his life in France in 1944. For Piers and all the remaining Talala family, they have but one hope, that Henry's death was not in vain.
But when you walk through the cemeteries and you notice that the average age is 19, 20, 21, it's a sad moment for many, many people. And I suppose, on a personal note, with the loss of Henry, one simply hopes that lessons, not necessarily drawn from Henry, but from people like Henry, are gleaned by people in positions that can cause war to happen, and that they think twice about doing so.